I've been working as a delivery driver for a few years now, and honestly, I never thought this job would give me a story like this one. It happened at the end of November, right around Christmas time, when people start ordering food like the world's about to end. Back then, I was taking as many shifts as I could because I wanted to save up for a decent gift for my daughter. I'd just gone through a divorce, so I wanted to do something special for her. It was one of those long nights with a light drizzle, the kind that makes the asphalt shine and the city feel eerily quiet. It was almost 11 p.m. when I got this weird order, a house on a street, way out on the edge of town. I didn't think twice. I accepted it because the payout was good, and I needed to hit my goal. When I punched the address into the GPS, I realized I didn't recognize the street. No big deal. It happens. But as soon as I made the first turn, I started feeling uneasy. The street looked like something straight out of a horror movie. Old, widely spaced streetlights with big patches of darkness in between. When I finally pulled up to the house, a chill ran down my spine. All the lights were off, and even sitting inside my car, I felt like the air was colder. The house looked old, with wooden boards that seemed like they'd creak just from a glance, and a yard that hadn't seen a lawnmower in years. I grabbed my phone to call the customer, trying to stay calm. After 2 rings, they picked up, but they didn't say anything. All I could hear was this heavy breathing on the other end of the line. I figured maybe it was a bad connection, so I said, "Hey, good evening. I'm here outside your house to deliver your order. Can you confirm this is the right place?" Silence. Just the same heavy, rhythmic breathing, like whoever it was had the phone right next to their face, but didn't plan on answering. I waited a few seconds, already feeling uneasy, and tried again. "Hello? Is everything okay with the order?" Nothing. By now I was seriously on edge, but I thought maybe it was an elderly person having trouble speaking, or even a kid messing around on the phone. I hung up and decided to send a message through the app, explaining I was at the door and asking if they wanted me to leave the order outside. While I was typing, I felt it, like someone was watching me. It's hard to describe, but the feeling was so strong I instinctively looked up. That's when I saw it. On the second floor of the house, in an old window with peeling wooden frames, there was a figure. It looked human, sort of, but something about it was just wrong. It was standing there, completely still, with its head slightly tilted, staring straight at me. I couldn't make out much detail because of the dim light, but what caught my attention was the smile. It was frozen, like it had been carved onto their face, and the lips were stretched so wide it looked painful. Slowly, the figure started waving at me. Not a normal wave, though. This was exaggerated, mechanical, like a poorly programmed ventriloquist dummy. For a second, I froze. I just sat there in my car, phone in hand, with the order on the seat next to me, completely unsure of what to do. My brain was scrambling for a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Who waves like that? In the dark? Without saying a word? I mustered the courage to look back at the window, hoping I'd imagined it. But the figure was still there, completely motionless, with that same awful smile plastered on its face. Only now, the eyes seemed wider, like they'd stretched just a little more. I don't know if it was the angle or my growing paranoia, but it sent a knot straight to my stomach. I started thinking about leaving, just canceling the order and driving away. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear of getting a bad rating on the app, or maybe it was morbid curiosity. I decided to get out of the car, even though my legs were trembling. I grabbed the food bag and started walking slowly toward the gate. The street was completely silent, except for the sound of my footsteps on the wet pavement. As I walked, it felt like everything around me was getting colder and quieter, like the whole world was holding its breath. When I got to the door, I noticed it had deep scratch marks, some so jagged it looked like someone or something had clawed at it, trying to get inside. That made me hesitate. I glanced back up at the window on the second floor, but the figure was gone. The relief was brief, though, because now I had no idea where it was. That's when I heard a noise behind me, something dragging across the ground. My heart raced as I spun around so fast I almost dropped the order. But when I turned, there was nothing there. Just the wind rustling a piece of plastic caught in a bush in the yard. I let out a deep breath, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, like those unseen eyes were still on me. I placed the order on the ground near the door and snapped a photo with the app to confirm the delivery. As I did, I heard a sound coming from inside the house, something heavy falling, like a piece of furniture being dragged or toppled over. My first instinct was to step back. The place looked empty and abandoned, but that sound, it didn't match. Suddenly, the light in the upstairs window flickered on, casting a dim, yellowish glow that barely illuminated the room. My heartbeat quickened as adrenaline flooded my body. There was no one visible in the room, but something deep inside me screamed that I needed to leave. Fast. As I started heading back to the car, I heard it, a faint laugh, almost too quiet to catch, coming from somewhere inside the house. It sounded like a child's laughter, but distorted, like it was being played on a broken, old machine. That was it. Without looking back, I bolted for the car, jumped in, and slammed the door so hard the noise echoed down the empty street. I started the engine and sped off, but not before glancing in the rearview mirror one last time. That's when I saw it. The figure was back in the window, waving again, but this time with both hands. Even as I drove away, that image stayed burned into my mind. The frozen smile, the hollow eyes, and the strange, unnatural movement of those hands. It felt like a warning, but for what? I had no idea. As I sped down the road, I realized my entire body was tense, my hands trembling on the wheel. The radio, which was always on at a low volume, started hissing with static, like something was interfering with the signal. I switched stations, but every single one was the same. Static, crackling, and irregular bursts of sound that only made the panic worse. I tried focusing on the road, pushing everything else out of my mind. That's when my phone, which was mounted on the dashboard, started vibrating. It was a call from the same number that had placed the order. I pulled over to the side of the road, unable to bring myself to answer right away. The name on the screen said John, but at this point that felt completely meaningless. Who the hell was this person? After a deep breath, I swiped to answer, but I stayed silent. On the other end, the same sound as before. Heavy, slow, rhythmic breathing. But this time, there was something else. A faint noise in the background, like footsteps echoing down an empty hallway. Finally, I worked up the nerve to speak. "What do you want? I already left the order." The response was a whisper, barely audible but clear enough to send chills down my spine. "You forgot something." Before I could react, the call disconnected, and the app on my phone suddenly rebooted. When it came back, the GPS had updated itself, redirecting me back to the same house. I didn't know what to do. Standing there or going back to that house both felt equally terrible. My gut told me to ignore it, go home, and forget everything that had happened. But for some reason, something kept pulling me back, like an invisible force was dragging me toward that dark street again. Reluctantly, I turned around and drove back to the house, every mile making the sinking feeling in my chest grow stronger. It felt like I was making the biggest mistake of my life. When I finally got there, the place looked even creepier. The light in the upstairs window was off again, and the silence was absolute. No wind, no insects, nothing. I stepped out of the car, my hands trembling and my heart pounding in my chest. The delivery was still sitting by the door, right where I had left it, but it seemed off, like someone had moved it. Before I could grab the bag and leave, the front door creaked open, just like in a cliché horror movie. There was no one there, just a dark hallway that seemed to stretch way farther than the house should have from the outside. Curiosity mixed with fear made me step closer, just enough to peek inside. That's when I felt something cold touch my shoulder. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. The emptiness around me felt mocking, like it was laughing at me. That icy touch was all I needed to want to bolt, but my legs felt glued to the ground. The door stayed open, as if it were inviting me inside. The darkness beyond the threshold seemed alive, pulsing, and every second I hesitated, my mind filled with worse and worse scenarios. Finally, I managed to take a few steps back. But before I could turn and leave, I heard that faint laughter again. This time, it was closer, almost directly behind me. I looked back toward the house and, for a brief moment, saw a shadow dart down the hallway. My entire body froze. It wasn't human. It moved awkwardly, like it didn't quite know how to use its legs. Without thinking, I grabbed the delivery bag and threw it inside the house, as if that would somehow close the chapter on whatever was happening. The door slammed shut the second the bag crossed the threshold. The loud bang echoed through the empty street, and for a moment, everything was dead silent again. I spun around and ran to my car, nearly tripping along the way. As soon as I got in and slammed the door, I realized I was gasping for air, like I'd just run a marathon. I started the engine and hit the gas, determined not to stop until I was as far away from that house as possible. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The rearview mirror showed nothing but the empty back seat, yet the sensation lingered as if someone or something was right there with me. The drive home felt like a waking nightmare. Every shadow cast by the streetlights seemed to stretch toward the car, and my breathing grew heavier with each passing second. I thought about calling the police, but what could I even say? I made a delivery and got freaked out by a creepy house and a grinning figure. They'd probably laugh at me or assume I was making up some excuse for canceling the order. Still, I couldn't stop replaying every detail in my head. The fixed smile, the childlike laughter, the icy touch. It all felt like something out of a bad dream. But I knew it was real. There was no way to fake that deep, burning sense of dread that still gripped me. When I finally got home, I locked the door and all the windows, as if that would somehow be enough to keep me safe. The night felt even heavier now, and every little sound in the house made me jump. I plugged my phone into the charger and noticed the delivery app was still open, but something was off. The order was still marked as in progress. That didn't make any sense. I had confirmed the delivery with a photo. I tried closing it out manually, but the app froze every time I tapped on it. Frustrated and still shaken, I decided I just needed to sleep. Maybe by morning, this would all feel less terrifying. As I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from the customer. "Thanks for the delivery. I hope you enjoyed the visit." My heart nearly stopped when I read that message. The idea that this person, or whatever it was, knew I'd been there, knew how to reach me, was too much to process. I deleted the message immediately, as if that would somehow make it all go away. But the unease lingered. I rubbed my face, trying to think straight. But the truth was, I was terrified. I decided I needed to tell someone. I called a coworker, Mark, who also worked as a delivery driver. I explained everything quickly, expecting him to think I was crazy, but he went silent for a few seconds. "You said it was on Santa Clara Street, right?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Man, I've heard some weird stories about that place." Mark told me other drivers avoided taking orders to that street because strange things always seemed to happen. He mentioned lights flickering on and off by themselves, disembodied voices, and even a driver who swore he saw someone standing in the middle of the road, only for them to vanish when he blinked. Hearing all this only deepened my sense of dread. "Stay away from there, man," he said, before hanging up. Cancel any order that sends you back there. That night, I barely slept. Every sound felt amplified. Every shadow on the wall seemed more menacing. When I finally managed to doze off, I was jolted awake by something that froze me to the core. 3 soft knocks on my window, followed by that same low, distorted laughter I'd heard at the house. I didn't have the courage to move. I stayed frozen under the blanket, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the knocks and the laughter. But then it happened again. 3 deliberate, soft knocks, like whoever or whatever was out there wanted to make sure I heard. Fear held me in place, but some part of me knew I had to check. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Slowly, I walked toward the window, holding my breath. When I finally worked up the nerve to look, there was nothing outside, just the empty yard and trees swaying slightly in the wind. Even so, I couldn't relax. This didn't feel like something my mind could have made up, not with so many vivid details. I decided to take a picture of the window, thinking maybe the camera would catch something I couldn't see. When I looked at the photo, my blood ran cold. There was something there, right at the edge of the window. A shadow. A figure with a human-like shape, but completely black, as if it absorbed all the light around it. Then suddenly, my phone's flashlight flickered out, and the screen started vibrating uncontrollably. A new sound echoed through the house. Footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, each one louder than the last. But I was alone. Or at least, I was supposed to be. In a panic, I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the door handle of my bedroom, unsure of what else to do. All I could do was sit there, paralyzed, waiting and hoping that whatever it was would leave. I sat on the bed, straining to hear anything beyond the footsteps, but now everything was silent again, which somehow felt even worse. My mind was teetering on the edge, desperately searching for any logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Why was this happening? And why to me? I tried unlocking my phone, but it wouldn't respond. The screen flickered, glitching, as if the device itself was being affected by whatever presence was in my home. Time felt frozen, and I started questioning if I should leave the safety of my room and face whatever was out there. That's when I heard something that made me freeze completely. A whisper from the other side of the door. It wasn't just random noise. It was the same phrase from the call. "You forgot something." I don't know where I found the courage, but I grabbed the closest object I could, a metal lamp, and crept to the door. With the chair still braced against it, I pressed my ear to the wood, trying to catch any other sounds. Nothing. Just silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. I took a deep breath, counted to 3, and decided to open the door. Somehow, facing it felt better than staying trapped in that unbearable state of waiting. I moved the chair, unlocked the door, and swung it open. The hallway was empty. The house looked the same as always, but something felt off. A damp, earthy smell hung in the air, like someone had just come from a wet, muddy place. And there, in the middle of the hallway, was something that hadn't been there before. The same food bag I had left at the house. It was the exact same bag, with the restaurant logo and all, but something about it was wrong. It was slightly open, and the packaging inside looked crumpled, as though someone or something had rummaged through it. My feet felt glued to the floor, my body refusing to move closer, but at the same time, I had to know. With trembling hands, I stepped toward the bag. As I bent down to pick it up, a chill ran down my spine. The air around me felt colder, heavier. Slowly, I opened the bag, dreading what I might find inside. Inside, there was something that definitely wasn't part of the order. An old photograph. It was black and white, faded, but I recognized it immediately. It was the house. That house. But there was more. In the upstairs window, the one where I'd seen the grinning figure, there was something. The image was worn, but I could make out a silhouette. It wasn't quite human. It was deformed, with unnaturally long arms and a grotesque posture. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. Where had this photo come from? And, more importantly, who had put it there? At that moment, my phone, which I had shoved into the pocket of my hoodie, started vibrating again. I pulled it out and saw another message from the customer. "I hope you like the gift. Come back whenever you can." I dropped the bag and the phone on the floor and bolted out of the house, not caring where I went as long as it wasn't there. That night, I decided I wasn't going to spend another second in that place. I needed to be anywhere else, anywhere that felt even remotely safe. I ran out without even bothering to lock the door. I jumped in my car and drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, trying to shake the overwhelming feeling that I was being followed. Every pair of headlights in the rearview mirror seemed more threatening than the last. Finally, I pulled into a 24-hour gas station to catch my breath and try to gather my thoughts. Sitting there in the car, I glanced down at my phone. As much as I wanted to ignore it, something compelled me to pick it up from the floor. When I unlocked it, the delivery app opened automatically. The order history was there, but something was off. The delivery address had disappeared. Not just the address, every trace of the order was gone, as if it had never existed. I called the app's support line, making up some excuse about a technical issue. After a few minutes on hold, the rep came on the line with a calm, professional voice. "Sir, there's no record of an order at the time you mentioned. It may have been a system error." I insisted, explaining everything. The customer, the address, all of it. But he kept repeating that there was nothing in their records. Frustrated, and even more confused, I hung up. How was that possible? The order was real. I was there. I saw everything. But now, it felt like reality itself was trying to erase what had happened. I decided not to go back home that night. Instead, I stayed in my car, or at least tried to. The feeling of being watched never left, as if that presence had latched onto me. The next morning, still sitting in the car, I was overwhelmed by a mix of exhaustion and paranoia. The rising sun made everything feel slightly less menacing, but the nagging sense that something was deeply wrong wouldn't go away. I made up my mind to go back home and face whatever was waiting for me. When I arrived, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. That didn't make sense. I was certain I'd left it wide open the night before. I stepped inside cautiously, my heart pounding. Everything seemed to be in its place, but when I reached the hallway where I'd found the food bag, it was gone. It was like nothing had ever happened. Maybe I was losing my mind, I thought, but then I noticed something that stopped me cold. In the center of the living room, on the wooden floor, was a new photograph. This one was clearer, in full color, and unmistakable. It was the inside of my house. In the photo, I was sitting on my bed, just as I had been the night before, my face frozen in fear. There was no one else in the picture, but in the background, reflected in the mirror, was the grinning figure, the same frozen smile, the same unblinking eyes, as if it had been watching me the entire time. I dropped the photo on the floor and bolted out of the house. I didn't even think about where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there. I drove straight to my brother's house, refusing to look back, determined never to return. At my brother's place, I finally felt a shred of safety, but I knew the ordeal wasn't over. I told him everything, expecting him to think I was insane. To my surprise, he listened carefully, his expression growing more serious as I spoke. "This reminds me of something," he said, heading to an old cabinet where he kept family heirlooms. He pulled out a wooden box filled with old photos and documents. "Here," he said, handing me a faded photograph. It was a picture of a house that looked eerily similar to the one where I'd made the delivery. "This house belonged to a distant relative of ours, great-uncle Jack. He disappeared years ago, and no one ever heard from him again. People say strange things happened there." That unexpected connection sent chills down my spine. Why me? Why that house? Despite my fear, I never received another strange message or experienced anything unusual after that night. A few months later, I moved to a different city, hoping to leave it all behind. But the memory never left me. Even now, I catch myself glancing at shadows, half expecting to see something watching me. And every so often, I feel a chill run down my spine, just like that icy touch from that night. Whatever happened, I still can't explain it. I just hope I never have to find out again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've never been much of a gym guy, but I've always enjoyed running. There's something about feeling the wind on your face, the quiet of the night, broken only by the sound of your footsteps. It's almost therapeutic. About 2 years ago, I started running nearly every night after work. I lived in a pretty chill neighborhood with tree-lined streets and a small park about 5 blocks from my house. It wasn't the best lit area, but I never felt unsafe passing through. Back then, I was coming out of a messy breakup, and running became my escape. Just me, my thoughts, and my favorite music blasting through my headphones. It felt like my safe space, until that night. Yeah, it started off like any other run. I left the house around 9 p.m. once the heat of the day had faded. Work had been rough, and I was looking forward to blowing off some steam. I laced up my new running shoes, a black pair with red accents that I'd bought the week before and thought were perfect. I even remembered the sound of the zipper on my running belt as I tucked my phone inside. Then I set off on my usual route, 2 laps around the park, followed by a loop through some nearby streets. But the moment I stepped into the park, something felt off. I can't explain it, but the place seemed quieter than usual. Even the crickets were silent, and the air felt heavier. It wasn't until I rounded the first curve that I noticed it. Someone was running behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's a park after all, and it wasn't uncommon to run into other joggers, even at night. But something about this guy unsettled me. He stayed about 30 or 40 feet behind me, matching my pace exactly. It didn't matter if I sped up or slowed down. He did the same. I didn't look directly at him, but from the corner of my eye, I could tell he was wearing dark clothes and had an oddly stiff posture, like his arms barely moved as he ran. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe he'd started his run around the same time I did. But the longer it went on, the stronger the feeling that something wasn't right became. I decided to test it. At the next fork in the path, I turned left, a direction I never took, just to see what would happen. That part of the park was even darker, with only a few streetlights working and tall trees blocking out the moonlight. My footsteps echoed on the pavement, and a chill ran down my spine when I heard it. His footsteps. The same rhythm, like a shadow following me. I glanced quickly over my shoulder, but couldn't see much. The lighting was terrible. All I could make out was his silhouette, still keeping that exact distance, like he was studying me. Nah, my heart started pounding harder, but not because I was tired. It was pure anxiety. I knew something wasn't right. Trying to calm myself, I turned up the volume on my headphones, but it only made things worse. Now I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, and that was somehow even creepier. I turned the music off completely and kept running, forcing myself to think rationally. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't stop myself from glancing back again. And there he was. Same distance, same pace. But now it felt like he was closer. Not physically, but like the space between us was charged with something heavy, something I couldn't explain. I decided to try something else. Instead of staying in the park, I veered off to a side street, one that hardly anyone used. It was an area with just a few scattered houses and tall trees casting long, dark shadows across the pavement. My plan was to see if he'd keep following me outside the park. The problem? He did. For every step I took, I could hear his footsteps right behind me. When I picked up the pace, trying to put some distance between us, I clearly heard his steps speeding up too. It was like he was mirroring my every move. My stomach tightened and adrenaline started pounding in my temples. I wanted to run faster to get away, but something in me knew this wasn't right. Something was really wrong. My breathing grew heavier as I tried to stay calm. I decided I had to face him to see who he was, to figure out what was going on. So I stopped abruptly in the middle of the street and spun around. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest, but when I turned, there was no one there. Nothing. The street was completely empty except for the shifting shadows of trees swaying in the faint breeze. I stood frozen for a few seconds, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, leaves, rustling, even breathing. But the silence was absolute. It didn't make sense. I knew I had heard someone. I had felt someone. Still standing there, I looked down at the ground, and that's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Just a few feet away from me was a single shoe, a running shoe. The exact same model, color, and even the same wear pattern as mine, the same one I had noticed on my own pair a few days earlier. Slowly, heart hammering, I stepped closer and picked it up. It was warm, like someone had just taken it off. The feeling was surreal, like I was holding a piece of a puzzle that shouldn't exist. I scanned the area again, trying to make sense of it, but there was no sign of anyone who could have left it there, or any explanation for why it was identical to mine. I didn't know what to do. I just stood there, clutching the shoe, trying to convince myself this was all some crazy coincidence. Maybe someone in the neighborhood had the same model. Maybe they dropped it while running. But deep down, I knew none of it made sense. People don't just vanish without a trace. The silence around me felt heavier, almost suffocating, and then I felt it. That strange, unnatural cold. Not the kind that comes from the wind, but the kind that crawls up from inside you, and that's when I heard it. A faint sound, so quiet I almost missed it. It was like breathing, long and uneven. I whipped my head around, every muscle in my body on high alert. The sound seemed to come from the trees, or maybe from the shadows they cast. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, but I knew I wasn't alone. Slowly, I started backing away, step by step, trying to make my way back toward the park where there was at least some light. But with every step I took, the sound seemed to follow, almost circling me. When I finally made it back to the more open part of the park, the breathing stopped, but the feeling of being watched, of something following me, didn't go away. Desperate, I hurried through the park, hoping to find someone, another runner, someone walking their dog, anyone who could make me feel less isolated. But the place was deserted. The few lamps that still worked seemed dimmer than before, like their light was struggling to cut through the darkness. I quickened my pace, just wanting to get home, but something held me back from breaking into a full sprint. My legs felt heavier, like the air itself was weighing me down. I agree. That's when I realized I was still holding the shoe. I don't know why, but I had this overwhelming urge to get rid of it, like it was the source of everything that was happening. It didn't feel like just a shoe anymore. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in my hands. When I finally decided to drop the shoe, something made me pause. It was like the air around me froze for a split second, and then I heard it, a whisper, low, raspy, coming from behind me. It wasn't a word or even a phrase, just the unmistakable sound of something or someone trying to communicate. My whole body locked up like I was frozen in place. With an immense effort, I managed to turn my head and glance over my shoulder, but just like before, there was no one there, except this time, it wasn't the emptiness that scared me. It was the fact that the shoe, the one I had just dropped seconds earlier, was now back a few feet in front of me, sitting right in the middle of the path. In that moment, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Pure terror, not just fear. Something deeper, more primal, like the universe itself was out of sync. That shoe couldn't be there. I just let it go, seen it hit the ground. But now there it was, exactly where my eyes kept drifting back to. Every part of me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like an invisible force was holding me there, compelling me to look, to understand. But understand what? With all the willpower I could muster, I took a step back. then another. The sound of my feet hitting the ground felt deafening in the silence. And that's when I saw it. Like, I don't know how or from where, but a figure began to emerge from the shadows. It wasn't quite a person, not really. It looked human, but something was wrong. It was too tall, too thin, its movements disjointed, like its joints weren't in the right places, and its eyes, those eyes were empty but somehow filled with a suffocating presence. It didn't make a sound. It just stood there staring at me, head tilted slightly, almost as if it were curious. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me to run, but my body refused to listen. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare where you want to scream or move, but you can't. The figure took a step closer, each motion disconnected, almost mechanical. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run colder. It didn't make a sound. Not a single noise as it moved, no footsteps, no rustle of clothing. It was like it existed on a different plane, one that didn't follow the same rules as ours. Suddenly, I felt the weight in my hand and remembered I was still holding the other shoe. And without thinking, I threw it toward the figure. The shoe hit the ground, sliding to a stop near its feet. For some reason, that made it pause. The figure tilted its head again, like it was studying the shoe, then slowly began to crouch. Its movements were deliberate, almost calculated, and as it reached out to pick up the shoe, I saw something that made my stomach drop even further. Its hand, it wasn't just similar to mine, it was mine. The same shape, the same scars, even the same little mark on my index finger from when I'd cut it as a kid. I was staring at a distorted version of myself, something that shouldn't exist. That was when my body finally snapped out of its paralysis. I turned and ran like I'd never run before. I didn't look back, didn't think, didn't even breathe properly. All I wanted was to get out of the park, out of the street, out of that nightmare. Every step felt like it took forever, but eventually I reached the park's entrance that led to my street. My legs were shaking, my feet barely felt connected to the ground, but I kept moving. The silence that had felt oppressive earlier now felt like a blessing, as if whatever that thing was had been left behind. But when I got to my house, something stopped me dead in my tracks. There, on my front doorstep, was the shoe. The same shoe perfectly placed like someone or something had been waiting for me. I stood there, staring at it, as if reality itself was crumbling around me. My instincts screamed at me to go inside, lock the door, and never come out again. But I knew that wouldn't fix anything. Carefully, with my hands still trembling, I picked up the shoe and hurled it as far as I could across the street. Then I rushed inside, slamming the door shut behind me and locking every bolt, chain, and latch I could find. Still shaking, I collapsed onto the couch, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was racing and I could feel the terror clinging to me, suffocating. It wasn't until I glanced down at my feet that I noticed the most horrifying detail yet. The shoes I was wearing were the same ones I had just thrown away. My heart nearly stopped. I froze, staring down, trying to convince myself it was a mistake, but it wasn't. The shoes on my feet had the exact same wear and tear, the same little scuffs, the same everything. I pulled one off, my hands trembling, and inspected the sole. And there it was. The same mud stain I'd noticed days ago in the exact same spot. My mind was spinning, desperately trying to come up with some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. It felt like I was trapped in a loop, a nightmare with no escape. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed up until dawn, every light in the house blazing, waiting for something, anything to happen, but nothing did. The oppressive silence pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. In the days that followed, I gave up running at night altogether and avoided the park at all costs. To this day, I still don't know what I saw that night or what that shoe meant, but sometimes when I pass the park during the day, I get the unmistakable feeling that I'm being watched. I never saw that shoe again, but every time I look at the pair sitting in my closet, I can't shake the feeling that they don't really belong to me. Like they came from somewhere or someone that was never supposed to exist.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
I've been working as a clerk at a 24-hour convenience store for about 6 months now. I've always been more of a night owl, so the graveyard shift seemed like the perfect fit. It's a lonely job, sure, but the quiet gave me time to think about life and even squeeze in some studying when things were slow. That particular night, just another random Tuesday, was even quieter than usual. The clock read 2:17 a.m., and I'd already finished all my usual tasks: stocking shelves, mopping the floor, and checking the inventory. I sat behind the counter with a lukewarm coffee, trying to stay awake while the security monitor showed a still image of empty aisles and the front door. Everything seemed normal, but I always kept an eye on the monitor, just in case. You never know when a drunk or a vandal might wander in, and it's better to be prepared. Then, the automatic door opened with that familiar ding. I straightened up in my chair, expecting to see someone walk in, but for some reason, no one did. I waited a few seconds, but the main aisle leading to the shelves was empty. I glanced at the security monitor more carefully, and that's when I saw him. A man in a dark jacket with the hood up, already inside the store, walking slowly. He didn't look up at the cameras, which instantly made me uneasy. I hadn't seen him come in, yet there he was, heading straight for the aisle that led to the restroom. Something about him felt off. It wasn't just the way he moved, deliberately slow, almost like he wanted me to notice, but there was something else I couldn't quite put my finger on. For a moment, I thought about calling out to him, asking if he needed help, but I hesitated. I didn't want to come off as intrusive, and honestly, there was something about the way he moved that made me want to keep my distance. I kept watching the monitor as he disappeared down the restroom hallway. It was a short, straightforward path, no way to get lost. The camera showed the restroom door slowly closing behind him, almost noiselessly. I made a mental note of the time. 2:19 a.m. Usually, people didn't spend more than a few minutes in there, especially at this hour, so I went back to keeping myself busy at the counter. But as the minutes ticked by, I started to notice he wasn't coming out. 10 minutes, 15 minutes. I picked up the radio on the counter and turned it off to hear better. Nothing. No flushing, no running water, just silence. It started to bug me. It wasn't unheard of for someone to fall asleep in there. I'd had to knock on the door more than once for that. But with every minute that passed, the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. I decided to check the cameras again, just to make sure he hadn't left without me noticing. I rewound the footage and watched carefully. There he was, walking down the hallway, opening the restroom door, stepping inside, and then nothing. I stared at the static image of the closed restroom door longer than I should have, hoping I'd somehow missed the moment he came out. But time kept moving, and he didn't show up on any other camera. There was no way he could have left without me seeing him. My mind scrambled for logical explanations, but that creeping sense of unease refused to let go. I got up from behind the counter, feeling that weird prickling sensation at the back of my neck, like someone was watching me, even though I knew the store was empty. I grabbed the restroom keys, something I always did when I had to check if someone was stuck inside, and walked slowly toward the hallway. The store felt colder than usual, and the sound of my sneakers squeaking on the tiled floor echoed louder than it should. When I reached the restroom door, I knocked 3 times, trying to sound calm. "Sir, everything okay in there?" Nothing. Not a sound. I pressed my ear against the door, my heartbeat thudding in my chest. Still nothing. Just an unnerving, heavy silence that seemed to fill the air. I took a deep breath and decided to open the door. As I turned the key and pushed the door open, a shiver ran up my spine. The restroom was completely empty. No sign that anyone had been there. No used paper towels in the trash, no footprints on the wet floor. I scanned every corner, checking the stalls and even peeking under the doors. Nothing. Everything was so pristine it looked untouched. Then I saw the mirror. On the glass, something I was certain hadn't been there before caught my eye. The word "exit" written in large, dripping letters, as if someone had used water to form them. My body froze for a moment, and my mouth went dry. I ran my hand over the mirror, but the word didn't smudge. It stayed perfectly clear, like it had just been written moments ago. I stood there, staring at the mirror, trying to make sense of it. The word "exit" felt like a warning, but it made no sense. Who could have written it, and how? The restroom was empty, and I was positive no one had come in or out. My gut told me to leave right then and there, but my curiosity, or maybe my stubbornness, made me keep digging. I decided to check the live camera feeds, hoping they'd shed some light on whatever was happening. I hurried back to the counter, my heart pounding and my mind racing with 1,000 theories. As I sat down and rewound the footage, something made my stomach drop. The clock kept ticking, but none of the cameras had captured the man leaving the restroom. He had just vanished. I started to think about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone walked into the bathroom and disappeared? It sounded ridiculous even to me. Instead, I went back to the footage and replayed it, frame by frame, focusing on the restroom hallway. That's when I noticed something I'd missed before. When the man walked in, his reflection in the glass of the automatic door looked different. It wasn't sharp and clear like the other reflections the cameras picked up. It was more like a distorted shadow, something that didn't belong. I swallowed hard, feeling a rush of adrenaline shoot through me, and then the door chime rang again. My eyes darted to the monitor, but once again, there was no one entering the store, just the sound of the chime echoing through the empty shop. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My body felt heavy, like something unseen was holding me in place. Finally, I forced myself to stand up and walk toward the entrance. The automatic door was shut, but it kept opening and closing on its own, as if someone were passing through it repeatedly. The ding of the chime was deafening in the silence of the early morning. I stepped closer, looking outside. The street was empty, just darkness and the faint sound of a dog barking in the distance. My breathing was heavy, and my hands shook as I tried to disable the door sensor. Maybe it was just a malfunction, I told myself, trying to calm down, but as I fiddled with the panel, something on the glass of the door caught my eye. It was a reflection, but not mine. For a split second, I saw the outline of someone standing behind me, in the hallway leading to the restroom. I spun around immediately, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest, but the hallway was empty. The fluorescent light flickered, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. I was overwhelmed by a mix of fear and confusion, unsure if I was imagining things or if something truly unexplainable was happening. The only thing I knew for sure was that I didn't want to be there anymore. I pulled my phone out of my pocket to call my manager and report what was happening, but before I could dial, the store light suddenly went out, plunging everything into near total darkness. I froze for a few seconds, standing in the dark, hearing nothing but my rapid breathing and the faint hum of the refrigerator shutting down. My phone was the only source of light, its glow faintly illuminating the counter in front of me. I used it to try to see better, but the store felt even more oppressive in the darkness. Deciding to turn on the flashlight, I aimed it toward the restroom hallway, the place that seemed to be the center of all this madness. Every fiber of my being screamed at me not to go, but something inside me needed to understand what was happening. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing off the empty floor, each sound amplifying my anxiety. As I approached the hallway, a strange smell hit me, a damp, metallic scent, like rust mixed with stagnant water. I shone the light on the restroom door and pushed it open cautiously. The mirror was still there, with the word exit glowing even brighter, as if it had just been written. The water forming the letters seemed to drip in chaotic, nonsensical patterns. Then, something in the corner of the restroom caught my attention. There was a puddle on the floor that hadn't been there before. The light from my phone reflected on its surface, revealing something that seemed unnaturally deep. I stepped closer, trying to make sense of it, but the more I looked, the more it felt like the water had no bottom, like it was a liquid black hole. A low sound, almost a whisper, began emanating from the mirror. I couldn't make out the words, but the sensation that something was calling to me was unmistakable. My heart raced, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the puddle. It was mesmerizing, as if something within it was pulling me closer. The whisper grew louder, almost as though someone were speaking directly into my ear. "Come." I finally understood the word. The voice was raspy and slow, and it felt like it was coming from deep inside me. I stumbled backward, trying to put some distance between myself and whatever this was, but I nearly dropped my phone in the process. The flashlight flickered for a moment, casting its beam onto the mirror. Now, alongside the word exit, there were handprints, smudged and wet, as if someone had pressed their fingers against the glass. I tried to summon the courage to leave, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. That's when the puddle started to move. The water began swirling slowly, forming impossible whirlpools. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed from behind me, a heavy thud. I spun around, shining my phone's light down the hallway, but there was nothing there. Silence fell over the store again, but this time it felt heavier, as if the air itself was weighed down by something sinister. I knew I needed to leave, but one thought gnawed at my mind. If this was an exit, where did it lead? I turned back to the mirror and saw something that nearly made my legs give out. In the reflection, the hallway behind me was full of shadows. Tall, dark figures that weren't there when I had looked before. They stood motionless, but their presence was unmistakable. They were watching me. I didn't wait to find out what they were or what they wanted. I bolted out of the restroom, nearly tripping over my own feet, and ran straight for the store's front door. I ran to the automatic door, but to my horror, it wouldn't open. I pushed against it with all my strength, but it was as if it were locked from the inside, the cold glass resisting every shove. Desperate, I turned my head to look at the cameras, and what I saw made me freeze. The screen was filled with static, with shadows flickering within the interference. Only one frame remained clear: the hallway leading to the restroom. On the monitor, the restroom door was wide open, and the mirror reflected the empty interior, except for one silhouette. It was the man in the jacket, standing motionless in the center, his hood covering his face. He was still there, even though I was certain the restroom had been empty when I left. I started shouting for help, but the store remained as silent as before, as if my screams were being swallowed by some invisible force. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys to unlock the door manually. That's when I heard the whispers again, this time coming from everywhere around me. The lights began flickering, briefly illuminating the shadows that now seemed to move within the store. A wave of sheer panic washed over me, an overwhelming certainty that if I didn't get out of there right then, something terrible would happen. Finally, I managed to unlock the door, and it slid open with a slow, grating sound. I bolted outside without looking back, the cold night air hitting me like a punch to the chest. When I finally turned to look at the store from the safety of the street, I saw something I'll never forget. The word "exit" was now written on the outside of the automatic door in the same dripping water-like letters. I kept running until I reached the other side of the street, where I stopped to catch my breath. From a distance, the store looked completely normal, as if none of what I had just experienced had ever happened. The fluorescent lights glowed steadily, and the automatic door was closed. But the word "exit" was still there, shining under the light, almost daring me to come back. I called my manager, my voice trembling as I tried to explain what had happened. He sounded confused and dismissed it, saying I was probably overtired and that the cameras were likely malfunctioning. I knew there was no point in arguing, so I hung up and stood there, staring at the store from afar. Every instinct in my body told me never to step foot in that place again. The next day, I quit. I couldn't imagine spending another night in that store. A few weeks later, a former co-worker called to tell me the restroom had been closed off for technical reasons, and that no one was allowed inside anymore. He didn't know why, but I heard rumors that other strange things had been happening to the overnight staff. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night. I don't know who that man was or what the word "exit" really meant. But sometimes, I still dream about that mirror, the puddle on the floor, and the shadows that seemed to watch me. I wake up drenched in sweat, with the unshakable feeling that it's not over, that something is still waiting for me. Whatever it is, I hope I never have to go back there to find out.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.